The Edmonton Oilers have won the Battle of Alberta and they're back in the conference final. Brett Holden joins us to discuss the Oilers and what makes this Oilers team different from some of their recent teams that didn't quite live up to expectations in the postseason. All that and more coming up on this episode of the Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, everybody. Welcome to the Locked On NHL podcast. Gil Martin, so glad to be with you as I am every Monday. And thank you for making Locked On NHL your first listen of the day. We are free and available on all platforms. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. Right now, it's my pleasure to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On Oilers, Brett Holden. And Brett, your team is getting the job done. Let me start it this way. What is different about this year's Oilers team that they're now in the conference final as compared to some of the other Oilers teams recently that had high expectations but fell short in the postseason?
They actually have depth scoring, and thank you so much for having me on here, Gil. I'm actually surprised to be here, genuinely, after going up against the Calgary Flames. But yeah, the Oilers have depth scoring. Zach Hyman scored in every goal in that series. He's the first Oiler to ever score in every game in a series. And when you take a look back at some of the previous Oilers, and I don't really have to go through all of them for everybody to understand, that is a very impressive stat for him. Vander Kane is 3 goals away from scoring the most amount of playoff goals in the last 25 years. The fact that Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl can have 2 or 3 assist games and still be considered kind of a quiet game for the two of them is incredible for the team. And now you can win games without 97 and 29 exactly being at the top of their game.
Yeah, that definitely does help. And it's interesting because, a lot of people going into that series against Calgary figured that the Flames had an advantage in goal with Markstrom against Mike Smith. And yet Mike Smith has done a pretty good job throughout that big Battle of Alberta series, even though there were some high scoring games in there.
Oh, absolutely. It almost gives you, and I don't want to jinx it. I don't want to jinx anything. I don't want to get there yet, but it almost gives you kind of Tim Thomas feels a little bit. Just the activity that Mike Smith brings, and the energy that he has. Obviously, I was getting into this conversation with my father last night, who's a generational Oilers fan. Every time he sees Mike Smith get out of the net, he goes, "No, stop." But at the same time, I was a goalie growing up, and the first thing that he said to me is the biggest weapon a goaltender can have is playing the puck. Well, when you have the best player in the world sitting at the far blue line and a goaltender who can actually make a play all the way up there, you know what? You go behind the net all you want. You make the plays that you want because that is the way the Oilers have built this team. And on top of it, he's making the saves the Oilers need him to make to feel comfortable when they do make mistakes.
Talk to me about the defense. It doesn't get a lot of attention, but there are some guys there who have really stepped up in the postseason.
Oh my goodness. Well, and I've mentioned this on my show as well, but just how much hate Cody Ceci got when the Oilers signed him. Leafs fans and Sens fans actually met up and shook hands at one point to all make fun of the Oilers, going, "You guys signed Cody Ceci?" But Pens fans were going, "Hey, treat him well, man. Treat him well." Because he can do what he's done. He has become the Oilers' probably number 1 shutdown defenseman. On top of that, you get a guy like Brett Kulak halfway through the season at the trade deadline who has been solid amongst any of the you can put him up almost next to any defenseman in the playoffs so far, and he has been defensively one of the best, one of the most stable as well. And those are just two guys. Tyson Barrie, who's had a tough defensive year since Jay Woodcroft, has looked like an actual defensive defenseman a little bit who can move the puck as well. You get a guy like and with experience like Duncan Keith, and that just and we haven't even got to Darnell Nurse yet. So that's a very impressive conversation to have for the Oilers if they want to win.
No question about it. Look, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl. I mean, both of these guys, 26 points in 12 playoff games. McDavid is a plus 19 in 12 playoff games. You know, we knew these two were superstars, but they seem to have even found another level so far in these playoffs.
I mean, the best players in the playoffs have to be the best your best players in the playoffs. And the Oilers are getting that. You mentioned the numbers in themselves, and you just can sit there and go, that is incredible. But then you go and watch them and how dominating they can be, and just how much they can run the offense, run basically anywhere. And a lot of they don't really get the praise that they deserve for their 200-foot game. That starts in their own end, and then they go and take it into the attacking zone and just have a layered attack and a layered cycle. And you just can't get these guys off of you. As soon as you start to commit to two of them, well, now you're to one of them, excuse me. Now you leave either Leon Draisaitl or Connor McDavid wide open to make a play and give them some open space. And then guess what? You can take your pick of Evander Kane, Zach Hyman, maybe Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, depending if you're on the power play. It's just pick your poison at this point for whichever team they end up playing.
I know Evander Kane was not the most popular player in hockey at the beginning of this season, but talk to me about the difference that he's made in this playoff.
Absolutely. I mean, the fact that he can add grit, add actual skills, the guy has just as many points that as he has played for the Edmonton Oilers. Let's be real. A lot of guys have been slotted in next to Connor McDavid. Going into the last playoffs, the Oilers had Dominic Cahoon next to Connor McDavid. Now they have a guy like Evander Kane who actually he has something to prove. He truly does have something to prove. As you even said off the top, he wasn't the most popular. He wasn't somebody that a lot of people really had etched into any lineups at all because of these issues. He's now come back. He's now played fantastic hockey. He gels so well with the team. I mean, you see him sitting there next to Jesse Puljujarvi and somehow actually understanding what he's saying, and they're jesting between the two of them. It is honestly, it's been fantastic to see just the way he's integrated into the city. Plus, I'm not sure if you saw, but he got a beautiful letter from an Edmontonian just saying that, you know what, I've never watched really Oilers hockey before until you came in, and my dream is to make it to the NHL because of you, Evander Kane. So he's making an impact not only on the ice but off the ice as well.
Colorado Avalanche stand between the Oilers and a berth in the Stanley Cup final. What are the keys in your mind to having the Oilers pull off? It would be an upset. So what would be the keys to pulling off the upset against Colorado?
Well, it was going to be an upset against the Calgary Flames as well, and they ended up doing it in 5. So I got to be honest, I'm feeling a little more confident going into this game. I think the thing is you got to get shots on Darcy Kemper. His last 3 games that going into St. Louis, he had an 833 save percentage in one game. He had a 900 save percentage in another. He's not exactly the Darcy Kemper that we saw in the regular season. And then when you take a look at how the Oilers took advantage of Jacob Markstrom, it's kind of similar to how they play. Now, obviously, as well, the Avalanche have the firepower that the Flames didn't have, and take your pick of Nathan McKinnon, Mikko Rantanen, Gabriel Landeskog, and on top of it, you got one of the I'm going to say it right here, probably the best defenseman in the league in Cale Makar, and the guy who's going to be the best defenseman in the league for years to come. And that's just another thing that the Oilers have to worry about to shut him down as well.
How do you think they approach that?
it's going to be tough. It's going to take the forwards as well. We talked about kind of how Leon and Connor have had the 200-foot game. It's going to have to take everybody at that point, because you're not just worrying about the three forwards coming in and barreling down on you underneath the face-off dots anymore. Now you have to worry about Cale Makar and them running a 4-person cycle. It's going to have to be a full unit effort in the defensive zone to shut them down. And then after that, it's all about the transition to try and score on them as well, which the Oilers have been fantastic in so far in these playoffs.
All right, Brett, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Absolutely. On Twitter, you can follow us at Locked On Oilers, and also over on YouTube, we're also Locked On Oilers. We like to keep it simple for everybody. We're all in the same place. Plus, you can follow me at The Real Holden 40, Holden, like Nick Holden, who's currently playing for Team Canada at the World Junior Championships. But you don't worry about me. Follow at Locked On Oilers.
All right, Brett, thanks for joining us. Always a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to actually be here.
Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. Our partners at BetOnline continue to be the #1 source for all your betting needs and sports info. Find all the latest odds, news, and sports developments, including this year's basketball playoffs, the Stanley Cup playoffs, Major League Baseball scores, fights, and even next year's NFL futures. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information, from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline, where the game starts.